Alive. Book 1, Chapter 18. The night was cool against David's skin. He stopped at the doorway to let the breeze flow over him, cooling him, calming him. It was a sweet sensation, something he never could have experienced in his former life. He hadn't even been aware of how hot it was inside until he'd rushed through the lobby, past the curious gazes of the family on the sofa, and into the open air. But after taking a few deep breaths to slow his beating heart, he understood something. It had not been hot inside. It was he who was hot. It was the flame in his chest, burning brightly now, fueled by the sight of her and the sight of his enemies. It was time to go. He dashed down the stairs and into the alley where he had stashed Teddy in a trash receptacle. The toy bear would surely be upset with him, but he would get over it. If having to hide in a trash can was the worst thing that this Teddy had to put up with, then he'd have a much easier life than the original. "Teddy, I'm back," David said, popping the lid on the improvised hiding spot. But Teddy wasn't there. For one horrible moment, David thought that the cleaners had come to empty the trash and taken his friend. But then he saw the loose piles of discarded junk in the opposite corner of the container. Teddy must have done that, he realized, trying to keep the offensive material away. David reached down and sifted through the scraps, hoping that maybe the bear was hiding in it. But there was only paper scraps, empty drink bottles, and gift boxes. "Not good," he moaned. On reflection, it hadn't been the greatest hiding place, but what else could he have done? Anyway, there was no time for self-recrimination. If the garbage people had not taken Teddy, then someone else had. He had to find out who, and to where. It was late, and he had a long way to go. He still had no idea how to make the journey across the water to the end of the world. And the longer he stayed in Rouge City, the more the risk of being found by old Mears' people. A sound came from across the cul-de-sac. Laughter. David turned to see some of the teenagers still sitting outside the eatery, joking and teasing one another. Their table was piled up with empty food wrappers, scraps of half-eaten meals, and plastic cups. Had they seen him hide Teddy? Had they come and taken the bear while he was gone? He began to make his way towards the teenagers to find out what they knew. "Looks like someone's up past his bedtime." The boy who spoke was leaning against one of the plastic tables, looking at David with an air of casual amusement. Another boy stood beside him, sipping loudly on a transparent cup that seemed to only have ice left in it. "Yeah, kid, ain't you a little to be out here?" he said. They both laughed at this, a bit too hard in David's opinion. It wasn't that funny. They looked to be about 16 or 17 years old, as far as David could tell. They sported closely cropped hair, telephonic plugs in one ear, and like the rest of the teenagers gathered around, they were dressed in colorful, expensive-looking clothing. David ignored the tease and glanced at the girls sitting at the table. They all had long, multicolored hairdos and were typing messages into their pocket pods or engaged in conversations with other kids on the little screens. "So, kid, you lost or what?" the first boy said. "Yeah," said his friend. "Think Mommy's gonna be a little mad if she finds out you hanging around the fun zones?" David decided not to beat around the bush. There wasn't time. "Have you seen my Teddy?" he said, knowing the likely reaction. As he'd expected, the boys glanced at each other and began to snicker. "Have you seen this teddy bear dude?" said the first. They both laughed too hard, again. One of the girls looked up at David and smiled. "Hey, cutie pie, what are you doing out here all alone?" she said. But her concern was short-lived, for she went right back to the conversation she'd been having with someone on the screen of her pod. "I left a super toy in that container," David said, seriously. pointing towards the alley behind him. "Did any of you see it get out, or maybe see someone take it?" A bored-looking girl with bright blue streaks in her long hair noticed the conversation and chimed in. "Oh yeah, the teddy bear. I think Styles took it," she said, pointing at the first boy without looking up from her pod. "He's got this thing for cute little toys, probably because nothing living will touch him," she said. The boy named Styles raised his hand at the girl and flashed a gesture that David had become very familiar with in his time with the gang. "This one's for you, Claire," he said. "No thanks. I don't know where it's been," the girl replied, still not looking up. "Did you take it, Styles?" David said. Something in his flat tone must have struck the teenager wrong. He stopped laughing, crossed his arms, and fixed David with a challenging look. "Well, maybe I did, brat," Styles replied. "Maybe I took it and, I don't know, threw it into the river or something." The other boy laughed. David did not. "Why would you do something like that?" he said, sizing the boy up. His time with Cy's crew had taught him how to read people, how to see through their facades. Styles shrugged, an arrogant smirk on his face. "Well, maybe because I figured any kid who thinks he's big enough to wander around in Rouge City in the middle of the night, talking crap to complete strangers, is probably too old to be playing with little—" Styles never had a chance to finish his reply. The ensuing series of events surprised David as much as any of the kids who witnessed. Everything seemed to pass in slow motion. It was as if someone else had taken over David's body, and he was only a passenger, along for the crazy ride. He felt himself jump forward, saw Styles' arrogant expression change into shock, saw the boy uncross his arms and try to grab his small assailant, and then saw the boy's mouth form into an oval cry of pain as David stomped down hard on his instep. He had learned a lot from the Wild Boys. Now he had a chance to put it to use. The other boy reached out for David as Styles buckled over, reacting to the pain that was shooting up his leg. But David sidestepped his grasp and took hold of Styles' hand, twisting his forearm so that it was locked around Styles, and then prying the larger boy's thumb back, locking it in a hold that drove him to his knees. Time reasserted itself. A few of the girls at the table had forgotten their pods now, their eyes bulging in disbelief over their gaping mouths. None of them looked bored anymore. The one named Claire guffawed and raised her pod to record what was happening. Back off or I'll break it!" David yelled as the other boy tried to pull him off. The boy started to swing a fist, but David twisted Styles' hand the way Wizzy had shown him. Styles screamed out. "I'll break it!" David yelled again. The other boy finally stepped away, his face uncertain. He'd been convinced. David had Styles trapped in a thumb lock, on his knees, his face pressed against the table. The boy swore and tried to shift his weight, but David twisted his hand painfully, and he eventually gave up. Wizzy called the move the Great Equalizer. When your opponent has the advantage of size, you have to go for his vulnerabilities, she had explained. Then she had demonstrated the move on David's own thumb. He'd never forget the pain. Styles probably wouldn't either. Now all the girls at the table had noticed the confrontation. "Oh no, he didn't," laughed one. "Are you seeing this?" said another, holding up her pod. A faint, "Oh my God," came from the speaker. "Do I have your attention now?" David whispered into Styles' ear. The boy nodded his head, hissing through clenched teeth. "Oh, this is so cute," laughed Claire. "Smile," she said, and all the girls' pods began flashing as they captured the special moment for posterity. David smiled for a couple of pictures and then turned his attention back to Styles. "Now let's try this again," he said in a calm voice. "Where is my teddy?" Scrappers. David repeated the word aloud as he ran past the closed storefronts of the family-friendly part of the city. He was headed for the waterfront, following the directions Styles had given him to find Teddy. The boy had finally admitted to seeing a dark-clad figure in the alley, while David had been in with Dr. No. He'd said the person had been rummaging through the garbage. "They'll be headed for the docks," the boy had explained, his voice twisted in pain and humiliation. "They're probably scrappers," he'd said. David didn't know what a scrapper was and didn't want to hang around to ask. He'd released the older boy's hand and backed away quickly, expecting to be pursued by the boy and his friend. But Stiles had obviously had enough, and whatever his friend saw in David's eyes convinced him that this was not someone to tangle with. Stiles had not even looked up when David had let go. He'd cupped his swollen hand against his chest and sat heavily on the table, swearing under his breath. The girls had laughed and waved at David as he dashed off to find Teddy. "See you around, cutie," the one named Claire had called out. David had stopped a few passers-by, asking if they had seen anyone carrying a toy bear, but all he got in return was laughter and a few annoying pinches on his cheeks. Then he saw a barricaded door that Stiles had mentioned. He'd made his way through the broken fence that led to the passageways Stiles had said the scrappers used to get down to the old docks. Once through the door, he found himself descending a long flight of stairs that led to an older, darker part of Rouge City. Like the hall he and Wizzy had used, the lights were dim, too dim, and the steps were wet and slick. The paint on the cement walls had flaked, and the whole place stank of fish and salt water. Little piles of trash had accumulated on the steps, so he had to be careful not to slip. Then a disturbing thought slowed David's descent. What if Stiles had lied to him? What if the boy had sent him on some fool's quest? Or what if this place was dangerous, or some kind of trap? He had no idea who or what could be lurking down there. David stopped and caught his breath, cleared his mind. He slowly cast off the rage that had driven him into attack mode. It was time to think this through. He knew he had to get out of Rouge City before Olmir found out he was missing and started searching for him. He had no idea where Teddy was. He could be here all night looking for the super toy. It was time to ask the tough question. Did he really need Teddy? Just the thought seemed like a betrayal, because, he admitted to himself, it was. But looking into the rank darkness below, an immediate answer came to him. It wasn't the one he liked, but it was the most practical. He could carry on without the super toy. He knew Mommy's name, knew where he had to go to find her. He had his own true identity now. And there were other considerations. If these scrappers were the kind of people David assumed, then they wouldn't be as easy to take on as a poser like Stiles. They would have lived the hard life, like he had, with the gang, and they would be made of sterner stuff. They'd never fall for a simple trick like a thumb lock. So even if he did find these scrappers, how would he get Teddy back? And there was surely no way he could report it to the police. Feeling shame and defeat wash over him, David turned and started slowly back up the stairway. He would find a tram to the shore, he decided, and then work his way back to the end of the world. It was the saddest, but the safest course of action. "Sorry, Teddy," he whispered as he ascended the stairs, hoping that maybe Stiles was wrong or had been lying after all. Maybe Teddy was somewhere above, maybe looking for David. Something clanged near the top of the staircase. David looked up to see the doorway open and saw 4 figures silhouetted in the faint glow of the bulb. "That's him!" someone shouted. Then they began to descend. David knew that voice. "Stiles, you devious jerk," he thought. Change of plan. David turned and started down the slick stairs, moving as fast as his feet would take him. David's experience with Sai's crew was coming in handy again, wandering the trails of the forest, practicing scams till the deep of night, having to stay on his feet for hours at a time, occasionally having to flee when things went wrong. All of it had fine-tuned his mind. Not only was he outrunning his pursuers, but he had also noticed a change in the staircase that they missed. He didn't see it as much as hear it coming. The ceiling lamps had been broken, and so the only light was coming from far above, making it hard for depth perception. So the place where the stairs leveled off appeared to be farther than it really was. But David noticed the echoes of his footfalls growing quicker and adjusted his footing just in time to keep from running into the wall ahead. The stairwell went off to the right at that point, and David could hear water rushing far below. Was that safety or a trap? He had no way of knowing, and really had no choice. So he continued, hurriedly, hearing angry calls coming down the stairs behind him. He had moved another 2 flights down when he heard someone yell in pain. He looked back to see dark figures thrashing about wildly. They had misjudged their footing and run straight into the wall. The thrill of the chase was rushing through his veins now, and he wanted to stop and taunt them, but he had no idea what lay below. Better to get there fast and find a path of escape. The boys quickly resumed their chase, and David could tell by the sound of their calls that they were really pissed now. He began jumping down 2 and 3 steps at a time. It was a dangerous strategy in the dark, but he was in a dangerous situation. The wall gave way to a large opened passageway that lay another flight down. Soon David could feel the fresh ocean breeze on his face and see the white tips of waves frothing beyond the dock. But in his excitement, he misjudged the last step. The ground was closer than he thought. A white-hot feeling flashed in his ankle and tore up his shin. He had to bite down hard to keep from crying out. He fell to his knees, grasping at his wounded leg. The voices were getting louder behind him. Frantically, David crawled ahead, seeking some place to hide. There were no lamps here, only the faint illumination from a thin crescent moon. David could barely make out indistinct shapes that lay ahead of him, boxes or crates of some kind. Beyond them lay the swirling waters of the Delaware. He struggled ahead. The darkness was suddenly broken by a beam of bright light, aimed directly into David's eyes. Then came a gruff, aged voice in a strange, halting accent. "Ah, look what I found," it said. Stiles arrived soon after, sweaty and out of breath. He had 3 other boys trailing him. They weren't that big, but there were enough of them to handle a smaller boy, or more likely to hold him down, as Stiles took his revenge. Cowards are pretty predictable. "I know you're out there, you little turd," Stiles yelled, rubbing his swollen hand and scanning the dock frantically. "When I find you, you're gonna be sorry. Real freaking sorry that you ever messed with me." Then he saw David, standing in a gray shadow near a tower of empty crates. He stepped towards the boy, his chest puffed up triumphantly. "Well, hello there, punk," he said. "Let's see you try that little trick on me now." But Stiles was caught off guard by the sight of David. He stopped, a confused expression on his face. David said nothing, only stared blankly back at the boy. "You lost?" said a gruff voice. Stiles turned to see a dark shape emerge from behind another crate. The man snapped on a flashlight and pointed the beam into Stiles' eyes. "Get that out of my face, man," Stiles said. The other boys backed away. None of them could see how big this guy was behind his flashlight, and none of them had bargained on a fair fight. The man complied, turning the beam of light towards the ground. "What are you boys doing down here?" he said. Now they could see that the man wasn't that big, and they got their confidence back. He was dressed in a faded and threadbare plaid jacket, time-worn jeans, and thick black rubbers on his feet. "We're looking for some punk kid who stole something from me," Stiles lied. The man turned the light on David. The boy that Stiles saw in the beam of light looked a lot like the brat that had humiliated him in front of the girls. But that boy had had black hair that hung down to his neckline. This one had shorter, blonde hair and was wrapped in a large black rain slick. And there was something about his eyes. They didn't seem to blink. They looked vacant. "Pretty sure this ain't him," the man said with a laugh. "This one belongs to me. Found it in the tunnels. Those guys from the sim shop dump the rejects here all the time, so they don't have to do the paperwork." Then the man shot the beam of light into his own face. It was old and wrinkled, with thick gray whiskers on his strong Asian features. "Ain't I the lucky one? Ha ha ha," he said, with a laugh that held more challenge than humor. Stiles looked back and forth between David and the man a few times. "So that's a mecha?" he said. "What are you, kid? An idiot?" the man grumbled. "Of course it's a machine. You guys been drinking, popping those trank pills?" Stiles glared uncertainly at David a moment. Then he sighed. "Hey, well, I know that little piece of garbage came down here," he said, his frustration rising. "You had to see him." The man suddenly turned the flashlight off. By the time everyone's eyes adjusted, he was face to face with Stiles. The boy jumped back, his fist raised and ready. But the man didn't seem fazed by the posture. A hint of humor came into his face. "Come to think of it, I did see someone," the man said, thoughtfully. "4 uptown softies who didn't know when it was time to call it off and head back up to the plaza before something bad happened." Perhaps it was the way the man had said it. Perhaps it was the dawning realization that this was the underbelly of the city, where people disappeared all the time. Whatever it was, Stiles dropped his fist and began backing away. He loomed a moment longer, looking around to see if the kid was anywhere in sight. Then he swore, rubbed his swollen hand, and ran off to catch his friends, who were already high-stepping for the stairs that led up to the controlled confines of Rouge City. It was safe there. They could pretend to be tough, without the risk of having to prove it to anybody. David let out his breath and fell to his knees. "Thanks for playing along, mister," he said. "No, thank you, kid," the man replied, in a voice like gravel. "That was kind of fun. Just for the look on that softy's face. Man, he didn't know what to do." He let out a deep, hearty laugh. "Ha ha, quick thinking on your part," he said. David did his best to laugh, but it came out like a moan. He sat and started to remove the rain slick the man had let him use. "No, you go ahead and keep that one," the man said. "No need to add a cold to your problems. I got plenty more at home anyway." The stranger who had saved David from a fight he was bound to lose gazed up at the ambient glow of city light that shone over the fenced rim of the wall, high above them. He seemed lost in thought for a time. "People up there live in a dream, a world without consequence," he said. "Don't know how to handle something real when they come face to face with it. Know what I mean?" David tried to agree, but could only grunt in pain. The man looked down on him and pounded a hand against his head, as if he'd forgotten something important. "Ah, what am I yakking about? Let me see your leg." He spoke as he inspected David's ankle. "Got to be more careful coming down those old steps," he said. "Nobody's supposed to use them, but security looks the other way. I guess they figure we're going to find a way in anyway, so at least they keep track of us this way." Something he did made David yelp in pain. "Oh, that's not good," he sighed. "You need a splint. Better to come with me." He touched David gently on the shoulder. "First, tell me, you got anyone else looking for you?" the man said. "Parents? Police?" David shook his head. Then he sighed in admission. "There could be some pretty dangerous people keeping an eye out for me," he admitted. He looked up, a plea in his face. He was going to have to trust this man. "I really need to get out of Rouge City, mister," he said. The man nodded thoughtfully. "Well, they'll have to be a lot more dangerous than those clowns to scare me," he said.
So, what do I call you?
My name is David, he replied.
Ah, a kingly name,
the man said.
And I am Hiramatsu, David. Call me Hiro. It's easier.
David let himself be pulled up to his feet, but when he tried to stand, the fire in his ankle flared. He stifled another cry.
Lean on me, David, Hiro said. It's not far.
David let his weight rest against the stranger, hoping he could trust him. He really had no choice at this point.
Oh,
the man said, as if he'd forgotten something again. He reached down and pulled something out of his pocket.
You still need this?
It was the black wig that Wizzy had given him for his disguise. It wouldn't do any good now. David shook his head. Hiro placed the wig back into his pocket.
Well, I'm sure somebody will, he said.
The thumping music of Rouge City rode faint on the night, obscured by the sound of the rollicking waters. Without marquees and holograms obscuring the view, the sky was a creamy glow of sparkling stars and a thin crescent moon set against the black void. David became absorbed in the sight, trying to keep his mind off the pain in his ankle. Hiro led him slowly past large transport crates where people had made makeshift homes. Weary eyes watched as the pair passed. Some of them closed the doors of their crates as they approached, apparently afraid of robbers. Small fires burnt inside a few of the crates. The faint aroma of cooking food was on the air. But it didn't smell too appetizing, whatever it was.
That's my place up there,
Hiro said, nodding his head at a point of light that was bobbing gently, as if afloat on the restless waters. It didn't seem that far, as well as David could tell in the darkness, but they had to stop occasionally to rest his swollen ankle.
So, you really steal from those kids, Hiro said.
Not exactly, David replied. But he didn't feel like explaining. He really didn't feel like talking at all.
Well, it's none of my business anyway, Hiro said. Being a scrapper, I guess I ain't one to judge. Just don't try stealing from me, and we'll get along fine.
You're a scrapper? David said. Hiro laughed again, but it wasn't a mocking sound.
Who else do you think you'd find down here, David? He said.
Did you happen to... David stopped himself, realizing that it might be better to put off a confrontation about Teddy. He was hurt, vulnerable, and this man had just saved him.
Did I do what? Hiro said.
I mean, I don't really know what a scrapper is, David replied in a smooth change of subject.
Well, what's it sound like? Hiro said. We collect the scraps that the uptowners throw away. Places like Rouge are filled with little treasures I can fix or sell for their parts. You'd be surprised what people think is worthless, he said.
David hummed a reply. Actually, he wouldn't be that surprised. Some people thought their own kids were worthless.
You read? Hiro said.
The question took David by surprise. I can, he replied, remembering the book display in Dr. No's lounge. I'd like to read more, he said.
Good, Hiro said.
He donned that thoughtful expression again, and his gaze wandered to the stars.
People don't read enough, especially history. They treat it like all the other stuff they throw away, without understanding its value.
David didn't know how to respond. This man seemed pretty thoughtful for a scrap collector.
There was a man named Stuart Chase, Hiro continued. He wrote a lot of books a long, long time ago, before the oceans rose, long before new cities were built to top the old ones, the ones that were swallowed up by the rising oceans.
Hiro fell quiet for a moment, seeming to be lost in dark memories.
The graves of drowned cities,
he said, his face grim. Then he suddenly seemed to come back to himself.
Well, anyway, he continued. This man, Chase, once wrote, "The story of the development of life and industry in America is the most amazing tale of the waste of wealth by a careless, improvident people that the world has ever known."
David was quiet, not sure where this conversation was headed. Hero smiled as if to a private joke.
"Took me a while to memorize that one," he said.
David nodded thoughtfully. "I'm not really sure what improvident means," he admitted. The man's laughter was gruff and heartfelt. After a minute, David found himself laughing along with him, even though he wasn't sure what the joke was.
"Well, here we are,"
Hero said. The light had indeed been bouncing on the waves. It was shining from the window of a large craft moored to a thick bollard that protruded from the edge of the dock. The bone-white surface of its hull reflected the scant light of the moon. Its empty masts rode high above the deck. "You live on a boat?" David said. But he was relieved that he hadn't been brought to one of those dirty crates.
"Technically, it's a cutter," Hero explained, "but I like to call it my junk."
Hero laughed, looking at David with an odd expectation in his eyes. But David just shrugged.
"A scrapper who lives on a junk? Get it?" Hero said.
Not really," David admitted.
"A junk. Large boat used during the Han Dynasty?"
Now David was really confused. Hero sighed.
Well, it doesn't work anyway. Junks were Chinese, and my people were from Japan. But still, pretty funny, huh?"
"Sure, it's funny," David said, doing his best to sound amused. A shrill cry broke through the night.
"Who is there?"
It was a woman's voice, coming from the center of the boat. David could make out a small figure near the large mast. Though he couldn't really make out the object that she had braced against her shoulder, he was pretty sure he could guess what it was.
"That's Chiyoko," Hero explained to David, "my beautiful wife."
He yelled some words in a language that David did not understand. Then he grasped the boy up and carried him on board.
"We have a visitor, my angel, my love,"
Hero said, as he set David down carefully on the thick pile of duffel bags.
"His name is David," he explained.
David's guess had been right. The thing the woman had propped to her shoulder was a gun, and it was a big one. He was glad when she set it down, because she didn't look too happy to have him aboard. "Hi," he said, cautiously, giving her the best smile he could muster in his pain. Chiyoko repeated his name slowly.
"David,"
she said, like it was some exotic word that she couldn't pronounce. She was a small woman, cloaked in the same type of dark rain slick that Hero had worn. Her hair was long strands of black and silver. Her back was bent from age. Her features creased from a long, hard life in the underbelly of the world. And her mouth seemed to be set into a perpetual frown. But when David looked into her eyes, he saw a hint of the same light humor that he had heard in Hero's gravelly laughter. The woman's jaw worked as she inspected David, like she was chewing on something that didn't taste too good. Then she spoke a rapid series of words that David didn't understand. This must have been Japanese. Once again, David regretted not having access to his digital brain. Hero laughed again.
"She thinks you're a toy," he explained. "Says she's seen pictures of something that looks like you."
"Yeah, I get that sometimes," David said, with a nervous laugh. This was definitely a conversation that could wait for another time.
"Trust me, my love, he's not a toy,"
Hero said to Chiyoko.
"And you don't have to be rude. Speak English for our guest."
The woman rolled her eyes, as if Hero had given away a trick of hers. Then she fixed David with a hard stare.
"You are running from something, boy,"
she said, in slow, accented English. Something about her gaze let David know that it would not be a good idea to lie. This was a test of some sort. "Yes," he admitted. "Gangsters and—" He shrugged apologetically at Hero. "And some men who work for the government." I don't know who they are or why they want me. I've committed no crimes. Hiro didn't seem surprised or concerned that David had left out part of the story. Chiyoko was quiet, her jaws working silently as she took this in.
Where are you running to, David? She said.
David took in a deep breath. He was certain that they would have nothing more to do with him if he told them. But he didn't want to lie anymore. Not to these people. I have to go to where the lions weep, he said. Hiro laughed.
Manhattan? He said. Why didn't you say that before? We pass that way all the time.
Really? David said, his excitement renewed.
Sure, Hiro said. You wouldn't believe all the stuff that big mecha company throws away.
You might be surprised, David thought. Can I come with you? He said excitedly. I can take care of myself. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a wad of nubucks. I can even pay you, he said. But Hiro just waved the offer away.
Not the issue, David. It's really up to my queen. On board, she is the boss, he said.
David set his eyes on the old woman. She gazed back, frowning. Her face was even more grimaced than before. After a skeptical moment, she clucked her tongue and started making her way down into the cabin of the boat. But she stopped and turned to say something in Japanese. The only word David could make out was his name. When she was through with her decision, she went inside and closed the door behind her. Well, David said to Hiro. Hiro shrugged to let David know it was out of his control.
She says you're a strange, skinny boy who is probably up to no good. She also says you smell funny, need to bathe. She doesn't understand why you look like that toy and thinks maybe you are not telling us the whole truth. But then again, she says you can tag along if you want.
If not for his ankle, David would have jumped for joy. He whooped instead and clapped his hands loudly. Yes, he yelled. Hiro shushed him.
We have to make some other stops first, so it'll be at least a week before we hit Manhattan. But that'll give you some time to heal, eh?
Great, David said. Hiro leaned over and ruffled David's hair.
It will be good to have you along, David, he said. Good for her, too.
There was something new in the man's eyes, just for a moment. Something sad. Then he hit himself on the head again.
Oh, almost forgot, he said. She also says if you can figure out how to keep the damn thing quiet, you can have a toy bear she found in the garbage in Rouge City. She tried rebooting it a couple of times, but for some reason, it won't stop calling out your name.